In the Sun and Moon era of the Pokemon TCG, Prism Star cards are a unique mechanic introduced in the Ultra Prism expansion. You could only play one copy of each Prism Star card in your deck, and if they ever left the field, they got put into the Lost Zone instead. Since you could only play one of each card, they were extremely powerful compared to other individual one-prize Pokemon. However, that doesn't mean all of them saw competitive success. Today, we're going to look over some of the worst Prism Star cards, in fact. So starting off the list at number 10, we have a Lance Prism Star. This card's effects lets you cheat out 2 Pokemon straight from your deck. If any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your last turn, you can take any 2 Dragon-type Pokemon from your deck and put them straight onto your bench regardless of their stage. This card was usable in a wide variety of deck lists in both the standard and expanded format. While it's widely usable, that doesn't mean every single deck wants this effect, as whether or not you'd want to run Lance Prism Star in your deck is entirely dependent on what dragon types you could play. For most of the card's time in the standard format, it never saw serious play due to not having many good cards to cheat out. Once the Team Up Dragonite released though, some players opted to use a supporter in their control decks. Dragonite's fast call ability lets you search any supporter card from your deck, a tool some control players appreciate having access to. With control decks having many one-of supporter cards, being able to use fast call to search them when needed was useful. If you wanted to use Lance Prism Star more aggressively, you could play a Salamence GX and Salamence from your deck, with the GX giving you Pokemon free retreat and the regular Salamence letting you switch your opponent's active Pokemon as long as it was in the active spot. Staging a comeback became a bit easier. In the expanded format, Lance Prism Star saw some usage to play a Alolan Executor, and recently has been used in expanded Giratina V-Star decks to play the namesake attacker straight from the deck. As better evolution dragon types are printed into the game, Lance Prism Star will only get better. And at number 9, we have Solgaleo Prism Star. For 1 Metal Energy, Radiant Star lets you attach a Metal Energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon in any way you like for each Pokemon your opponent has in play. For 4 Metal Energy, Corona Impact dealt 160 damage, but Solgaleo couldn't attack during your next turn. It's the Radiant Star attack that gave Solgaleo Prism Star its competitive niche early on. In the standard format of the time, Duskmane Necrozma GX was a fairly popular deck that sought to power up Duskmane's Meteor Tempest early and consistently. When going second, after your opponent placed cards onto their bench, Radiant Star was capable of attaching enough energies to Duskmane for Meteor Tempest on its own. Even in the late game, if for some reason you weren't able to set up Magnezone, the deck's usual means of attaching multiple energies per turn, Radiant Star helped enable attacks. Magnezone also meant that Corona Impact was easy to access as an extra attacking option if needed. Solgaleo Prism Star also had a small niche in wall decks. These decks played Pokemon that were extremely difficult to KO while setting up a win condition like Unknown's Hand ability. In wall strategies, Solgaleo's 160 HP on a Steel-type Pokemon meant it was a huge pain to KO. With the damage reduction effects like Lucario and Melmetal's Full Metal Wall GX attack and Metal Frying Pan, it could take upwards of 220 damage in a single attack to KO Solgaleo. If your opponent wasn't able to knock it out, the wall player had an extensive amount of healing options to restore the damage. Although it was a small niche in a very specific subset of decks, the role was legitimate. Having these roles meant that Solgaleo is only at number 9 on this list, and paints a picture of how good most Prism Star cards are. And at number 8, we have Giratina Prism Star. This Pokemon has 160 HP, the Chaotic Star ability, and the Crisis Dive attack. When Giratina is put onto the bench, Chaotic Star lets you attach up to 2 Psychic Energies from your hand to it. The Crisis Dive attack costs 4 Psychic Energy, and deals 160 damage at the cost of discarding 2 Psychic Energies attached to Giratina. Having a basic, single-prize Pokemon in your deck that accelerates energy to itself while dealing massive damage could significantly skew a prize trade with your opponent. If you use Crisis Dive to KO a 2-prize Pokemon, and they can only KO your 1-prize Pokemon, Giratina would put you significantly ahead. In the standard formats where Giratina Prism Star was legal, it fit especially well into the premier Psychic-type deck at the time. These decks using Malamar's Psychic Recharge to attach Psychic Energies from the discard pile to their Pokemon to create a constant stream of strong attackers. If your Giratina Prism Star survived to your next turn, Malamar could recharge the attack again and allow for multiple high-damage Crisis Dives. Thanks to Chaotic Star, it was also easy to attach the initial energy to Malamar decks, playing an above-average count of energy cards. The issue with Giratina isn't that the card is bad, but that it simply is outclassed as a single-prize attacker by other Psychic options. Malamar decks had no shortage of efficient one-prize attackers. Funnily enough, the non-Prism Star Giratina was the most reliable option due to its Distortion Door ability, allowing you to put it onto your bench from your discard pile. Because you'd always be able to get Giratina back after it gets KO'd, and its Shadow Impact attack 2-hit KO most Pokemon GX, it was often better to use Giratina over Giratina Prism Star. If your goal was to have a 4 energy attack cost that dealt massive damage, Lunala Prism Star was seen as a more desirable option due to its Psy Storm attack having a far higher damage cap than Crisis Dive. Once again, Giratina Prism Star is a decent card. There's just better options that stopped it from seeing more regular play. And at number 7, we have Cyrus Prism Star, the first Prism Star supporter on this list. This supporter has the unique effect of making your opponent shuffle all but 2 of their bench Pokemon into their deck, but you can only play it if your active Pokemon was a Water or Steel type. There is no supporter card in the history of the game with a comparable effect to Cyrus Prism Star. Even so, there were a few factors holding the card back from having more success than it seemingly should have had. Firstly, the restriction on being able to play it only if you had a certain type of Pokemon greatly limited the amount of decks you could even play the supporter in. When the card first released, it saw very occasional play with Glaceon GX or White Kyurem. Despite the later release of Jirachi, a Steel-type Pokemon that saw play in almost every deck as a consistency boosting tool, Cyrus Prism Star failed to catch on due to its other downside. As your opponent got to pick the Pokemon they shuffled back into the deck, they'd always get rid of cards that just weren't needed anymore. Not to mention that plenty of decks existed at the time which could function perfectly with just 1 or 2 bench Pokemon. The only time Cyrus Prism Star was ever going to pull its weight as your 1 supporter per turn was against decks which needed every single one of their bench Pokemon. The standard format of the time simply wasn't fit for an effect like Cyrus's. And at number 6, we have Lusamine Prism Star. This supporter has the effect to prevent all damage dealt to your Ultra Beast Pokemon during your opponent's next turn, but could only be played if they have exactly 3 or 4 prize cards remaining. On anything but a Prism Star card, certain decks having access to supporter which prevents all damage would be pretty broken. Unfortunately, since you can only play a single copy of Lusamine in your deck, most Ultra Beast decks just didn't care about it. The restriction on when you can play Lusamine meant enabling the card was quite awkward, as you needed a way to find it before or on the 3 or 4 prize card turn. As Lusamine Prism Star as a supporter, you either needed to draw it before your opponent went down to 3 or 4 prizes, or have Pokemon abilities that make finding it on the needed turn much easier. The issue of needing your once per turn supporter usage was also exacerbated by how Blasphalon, the Ultra Beast deck at the time, played. Since Blasphalon was a single prize attacker that sought to take big multiple prize KOs before getting knocked out, you usually had to set up a new one on your turn. In order to power up its Fireball Circus attack turn after turn, the deck played Welder. You pretty much had to use Welder as your supporter every turn, so you had no opportunity to play Lusamine. Lusamine's effect is absurdly strong. It just didn't fit in the deck it was meant to support. And at number 5, we have Darkrai Prism Star. With its Nightmare Star ability, when you play Darkrai from your hand onto the bench, you can attach up to 2 Darkness Energy from your hand to it. It also has the Abyssal Sleep attack for 4 Darkness Energy, which deals 120 damage and puts a defending Pokemon to sleep. While that Pokemon is asleep, your opponent has to flip 2 coins in order to try and cure the status condition. Even though it shares the same good ability as the previously mentioned Giratina, Darkrai Prism Star never had a good deck to slot into. For the first few iterations of the standard format the card was in, there was no deck that needed a way to put multiple Darkness Energy into play with Nightmare Star. After the release of Weevil GX, a card which lets you move around your energy from Darkrai to other, more powerful attackers, Nightmare Star's extra energy lets you quickly establish the energy cost needed for Darkrai and Umbreon GX, or Sableye and Tyranitar GX. In these decks, Darkrai could also be used as a single prize attacker if need be due to the flexibility provided by Shadow Connection. Sadly, Weavile GX decks were never able to catch on to the metagame due to being overall weaker than other decks in the meta. Darkrai also couldn't find a niche in the expanded format, where Turbo Dark, a deck that wanted to spam the field with as much Darkness energies as possible, had better means to do so than Nightmare Star. With item cards like Dark Patch and Max Elixir that played energy from the discard pile and deck respectively, a card that got energy out of your hand wasn't needed. The Weavile deck that has seen competitive play with Darkrai Prism Star and its niche was legitimate, so the card isn't higher on this list. And at number 4, we have Arceus Prism Star. Its first law ability prevented all effects of attacks done to it. For a single colorless energy, Trinity Star dealt 30 damage and lets you attach up to 3 basic energy cards from your deck to your Pokemon in any way you like, but you could only use it if you had a Water, Grass, and Electric-type Pokemon on your bench. Much like the aforementioned Cyrus Prism Star, it's that harsh restriction that limited which decks could take advantage of Trinity Star's incredible effect. Using a single Trinity Star to start off the game puts you enormously ahead of your opponent in terms of energy in play. However, just because the effect was hard to take advantage of doesn't mean it was impossible. The card first saw play in a deck revolving around Xerneas's Rainbow Force attack. which dealt 10 damage plus 30 more for each type of Pokemon on your bench. Xerneas decks played a multitude of different types in order to boost Rainbow Force's damage as much as possible. Notably, the deck regularly ran Galvantula and Valcania on EX. Having both of these Pokemon in play fulfilled the requirement to use Trinity Star, although it wasn't possible to do so on the first turn, as Galvantula was a Stage 1 Pokemon. The second deck to see competitive success using Arceus Prism Star was decks using White Kyurem. In this deck, Trinity Star was one of the best ways to quickly set up the 3 energy needed for Kyurem's Freezing Flames attack. The deck utilized cards like Zebstrika as a draw engine and Pheromosa for its free retreat to provide all 3 of the needed types for Trinity Star. Once your deck got 3 energy in play, Wishful Baton allowed you to move it onto your other Pokemon after the attached Pokemon got KO'd. With multiple batons, you could easily chain together Freezing Flames every turn. Once the Tag Team Pokemon were released, the deck fell out of the metagame due to being unable to compete with the heightened power level of the format. But for a very brief time, Arceus Prism Star had a solid role in a deck presented at the competitive level. Had the deck not been power crept so quickly, it's likely Arceus Prism Star would have had more competitive placements. And at number 3, we have Lysandre Prism Star. With this card, you could put cards in your opponent's discard pile into the Lost Zone up to the number of Fire-type Pokemon you have in play. There are a few reasons as to why this card doesn't see much, if any, serious tournament play. Firstly, like many of the Prism Star supports on this list, it has a specific requirement that seriously limits its usability in a majority of decks. Fire-type decks, especially during the standard format Lysandre Prism Star was legal in, were incredibly fast, aggressive decks using cards like Welder to accelerate energy onto their attackers. These decks did not need a card to put their opponent's discard into the Lost Zone. In fact, there were very, very few decks that even remotely wanted this effect. While there have been discard pile reliant strategies throughout the history of the Pokemon TCG, simply putting cards into the Lost Zone up to the number of Pokemon you have with a specific type doesn't really affect their ability to play in a meaningful way. The only time the deck has seen tournament success was in a control deck using Magcargo GX, and Oricorio. In this deck, Lysandre Prism Star was a tech option to beat the controlled mirror match by putting their opponent's supporters that they lit with Cynthia and Caitlyn into the Lost Zone. Something important to note about this niche is that Lysandre Prism Star sees competition over it with Giratina, whose Get Lost attack puts 2 cards from your opponent's discard pile into the Lost Zone for 1 colorless energy. When it comes to disrupting various supporter loops control decks seek to use, Get Lost's ability to Lost Zone more cards over multiple terms is greatly preferred, since control strategies will rarely try to KO it. While there's no damage coming Giraffarage's way, it's free to sit in the active spot, getting rid of the discarded cards. The card is so strong versus control strategies that in the expanded format where Giraffarage is still legal, it occasionally sees play in non-control decks like Arceus V-Star to help shore up their matchup against the archetype. Lysandre Prism Star is outclassed in what you'd want to use it for, but it does have a single high-level tournament placement, so it only gets number 3 on this list. And at number 2 in this list, we have Latios Prism Star. This Dragon-type Pokemon has a single attack. For 2 colorless energy, Dragon Fleet deals 50 damage for each of your Dragon-type evolution Pokemon in play. At this point in the list, the Prism Star cards we're going to talk about just never had a deck to see play in. Dragon Fleet wants you to build your strategy around having multiple Dragon-type evolution cards in play to maximize its damage output. For Latios Prism Star's time in the standard format, no deck that wanted to utilize multiple evolution Dragon types existed. While there were good cards that supported the Dragon type like Xenia, Lance Prism Star, and Dragon Talon, this type of deck never caught on. The main issue with building around Dragon types is their attacks usually require multiple different types of energy to use. For example, Rayquaza GX, the best Dragon type card at the time, needs both grass and electric energy to use its attacks. The other issue with Latios specifically was that the best Dragon-type attackers were basic Pokemon. Decks like Rayquaza GX didn't use any supplemental evolution Pokemon that could increase Dragon Fleet's damage, so Latios was never considered. Evolution Dragons just weren't played during the standard format, so Latios Prism Star never had a deck to see play in. And finishing off this list, the number 1 worst Prism Star card in Pokemon TCG is Celebi Prism Star. This Pokemon has the Time Distortion attack that allows you to devolve as many of your bench Pokemon as you like to their previous stage for a single colorless energy. Its second attack, Leech Seed, doesn't matter at all towards its viability or lack thereof, and isn't worth talking about. The concept behind why you'd want to devolve your own Pokemon is so that you can reuse strong on evolution abilities. While there are certainly good abilities to reuse, it's generally not worth using an attack in order to devolve your own Pokemon. For instance, Mildex leveraging Rhyperion's toppling wind ability used Super Scoop Up to re-evolve their Pokemon. By using Celebi Prism Star, you had to find both an energy and attack, meaning you couldn't set up another Pokemon or use another attack in the process. Not to mention that Celebi only had 90 HP, so it was vulnerable to getting KO'd after using Time Distortion a single time. Once Celebi got knocked out, due to the Prism Star mechanics, you'd never be able to get it back either. There was no deck that wanted the effect of Time Distortion. Due to having no niche whatsoever, Celebi Prism Star is the worst Prism Star Pokemon in the Pokemon TCG. Alright, and that's the video. Do you think we missed any other worse Prism Star Pokemon, or do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below. And thank you for watching.